Thanks everyone for making it along to the second part of this webinar series. So Pinion Advisory are delivering these two webinars related to dam construction permits and water licensing applications on behalf of the TAS Farm Innovation Hub through some federal funding from the Future Drought Fund. So earlier this year, we gathered together groups of Tasmanian farmers from around the state into some small focus groups to hear from them what their priorities were for on-farm water use. And we heard time and time again that farmers were experiencing challenges with navigating the processes around farm dam permit applications and water licensing applications. So we've taken the opportunity to bring together some consultants and also representatives from the Department of Natural Resources and Environment to help share where to find more information and also some basics around those different processes. We heard last week in our first webinar around the dam construction process, and then today we're going to focus a little more on the water licensing area. These two areas do complement each other and there is some overlap. The recording from last week's webinar will be available really soon on the TAS Farm Innovation Hub website, and we will share that link with everyone who registered so that you could go directly to that recording if you did happen to miss last week's. And the same, today's will be recorded and will be made available. We'd just like to start with acknowledging the support and resources which are all housed within the NRE team. So we have Bill and Henry joining us on today's webinar, and they'll be available at the end of the webinar to help with any questions that people might have. And they're also able to jump in on the delivery of today's webinar to clarify anything. So we understand this is a really complex space. NRE are all over the legislation and the processes. Pinion Advisory are just one provider who are out there able to support farmers and landowners navigate this space. And they're just sharing some of the insights and experiences that they have had supporting landowners over the years, if you like, in sort of some common questions and things that arise. That's just some context for you about today. Just very briefly, some housekeeping. Obviously, we're delivering this through Zoom. There's a toolbar along the bottom of your screen, which can help you with some of the processes throughout the webinar. As I said, we are recording the webinar. If you would rather not appear on the recording, please feel free to turn off your video using the stop video button on the bottom left, and that will stop you from being seen on the recording. We'll ask if you could please keep muted. This just helps with background noise that could be a distraction for others trying to listen in. Where possible, please use the chat function throughout the webinar to jot down any questions or comments that you might have. I'll be monitoring that. And also Bill and Henry will be able to see that, and we might be able to put in some simple feedback for you. But we will be opening up the microphones towards the end of the webinar for you to ask other questions. If you would like to raise your hand to ask a question at the end, there is that reactions emoji, and you can use the raise hand function to show us that you would like to ask a question. Okay, I'll introduce the deliverers for today's webinar. Alistair Brooks will be presenting most of the information today. So Alistair leads our water monitoring and operations team at Pinion Advisory, and he's been working with landholders for many years, supporting them with solutions in that water development space. On supporting him today is James Curran, who also has worked extensively in that water resource development space. And he'll be just jumping in with little insights and things throughout today's webinar, and also able to help with the Q&A at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to Alistair.
Thanks, Joe. I'll just try and share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, we sure can. You're just still in, but not in the slide sharing. There we go. Thanks, Alistair.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. As Joe mentioned, this is a bit of a follow-on from last week's session, which James did, the dam permitting assessment session. There is some overlap with water licenses and dams, and we'll try and distinguish between the two processes a little bit, but they do sort of go hand in hand a bit with each other, albeit in saying that they are totally separate processes. So keeping that in mind. So the points we'll cover today is just a brief outline of what is a water license. We'll talk about a water license versus a water allocation, when a water license is required, how you go about obtaining a water license, the surety levels, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail because that's probably quite important in regards to the level of or the type of water allocation you have. We'll mention and touch on hydro catchments and water management plans, as there's some sort of rules around water allocations in those catchments. A little bit of general information about the water licensing process. And then we'll do a little live demonstration of what's called the water assessment tool, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But basically that's it's a hydrological modelling tool that the department have developed to, I suppose, effectively allocate water across the state. So effectively, you can click on a spot on a water course on a map, and that water assessment tool will tell us how much water there is available. So we'll demonstrate that. So basically, what is a license? Just a little bit of background. The Water Management Act 1999 sort of sets out how water is regulated in Tasmania. This act superseded the original act that was developed in 1957, and it was basically administered by the Rivers and Water Supply Commission back in those days. But it was recognised sort of in the late 90s, I suppose, that that act was fairly out of date. We needed to get up to standard with probably other parts of the country. The Murray-Darling Basin in particular was a hot topic back in those days with regards to over-allocation. So there was a big push for agencies across the country to get their legislation up to speed. And so that Water Management Act of 1999, I suppose, probably took 3 or 4 years to be developed or written. There was a lot of public consultation with that, and then that came into existence, I think, in 2000. So that's the piece of legislation that regulates pretty much how water is allocated across the state. So basically, a water license specifies where you're allowed to take water from and for what purpose. So if you basically need a water license to take water for a commercial purpose, that might be irrigation, it could be for a feedlot, it could be for a fish farm, and it's generally out of a river, a stream, creek, or an in-stream dam. It's some sort of water body that's, I suppose, connected in a sense to a water course. You must have as I said, you must have a water license to take any water for any sort of commercial purpose, and they're sort of listed in that bottom dot point. There's a little, I suppose some people occasionally get a little bit confused between what's a water license and what's a water allocation. Well, you need a water license to have a water allocation. So basically, a water allocation sort of specifies how much you can take, how much water you can take, the period through the year when you can take it, and then what the water can be used for. This process is administered through, or I think the Act refers to the Minister. Let me know if I'm wrong there, Bill, but yep, it's through the Minister. And then there's some delegation from the Minister down to the department people through the Department of Natural Resources and Environment to I suppose, assess any applications that come in, and also undertake the regulations of existing allocations, making sure people, take their allocations according to what their water license allows them to do. And I'll show that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Just a little quirky point, you can hold a water license without necessarily having a water allocation. So for example, if you had a water license and you transferred your allocation to somebody else, you can still keep that water license, but you may then not have a water allocation. But to have a water allocation, you have to have a water license. So if I was transferring my allocation to someone else, they would have to get a water license first, and then they could then accept that water allocation through the department. These transfers and in terms of applications for water license all go through the Department of Natural Resources and Environment. So just a few comments about when a water license is required. So as I mentioned before, it's required for any type of commercial purpose, i.e. irrigation, fish farms, hydroelectric, feedlots and so forth. But if your property has a direct frontage to a watercourse, so to a river, a dam on a watercourse, a lake, you have then what's called a riparian right. But you do have to have a direct frontage, so you can't have your land needs to either border that watercourse or your title needs to, in some cases, go to the centre of the river. And these rights, these riparian rights, are basically established under the Water Management Act as Part 5 rights. They entitle you to take stock and domestic water, and they're governed, if you like, if that's the right word, under the water regulations section of the Act. So basically it allows you to take water for stock, domestic, and obviously human consumption. But you can only take water for those purposes, and the amounts are quantified under the water regulations. So if you have a 10,000 hectare property, you can obviously take more stock and domestic water than compared to if you have a 2 hectare property, because you are allowed to take so much water for each cow, sheep, person, and garden and so forth. If you don't have direct frontage to a watercourse, you're basically referred to as being non-riparian, and therefore then you need a water license. So for example, if there was a river reserve between your boundary and a river, say of 20 or 30 metres in width, technically you need to have a water license to be able to take stock and domestic water or water allocation. Under the old Act, under the 1957 Act, I think you could actually take water providing that distance was less than 20 metres under what's called a quasi-riparian right. But my understanding is that didn't come across under the new Act. You basically have to have a direct frontage to that water source. Is there someone got their hand up? I'm not sure. Just got a little pop up then, but.
Oh no, that was me just placing the link to the Navary website in the chat. Sorry.
So as I said before, a water license is required for any commercial purpose. Just not, as I said earlier, just to distinguish between a dam works permit and a water license or application. The processes are different. A dam works permit only allows you to if you get a permit to construct a dam, it doesn't actually entitle you to take water. So you need both, basically. You need to get, if your dam's located on a water course and you're looking at taking water for irrigation, you need a dam works permit to build the dam, and you have to build the dam, as James outlined last week, to the conditions of that permit. And then the water license allows you to take water, again, under certain conditions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Or you might pump water from a water course into a dam. But either way, you need, if you are taking water into that dam for a commercial purpose, you need a water allocation. So to sort of go through this process of obtaining a water license, you effectively need to engage a consultant, mainly because the consultants have access to the water assessment tool via the department, and that water assessment tool, which again I'll talk about a little bit later, allows us to assess what water is likely to be available. That consultant generally has a bit more knowledge around what's allowed in various catchments. That might be a hydro catchment, or it might be a catchment with a water management plan. And again, I'll talk about those in a moment. So it's difficult for just an average person, I suppose, off the street, so to speak, to put an application in for a water license without knowing the process, without being able to complete that water assessment report that comes out of the water assessment tool. So as James mentioned last week, the department has a list of consultants on their website. So there's a number of consultants that can be used to do that, to undertake that process. And generally the consultant would prepare the application form and the supporting documents. The landowner would obviously have to sign the form and pay the fees, the application fees to the department, and then the rest of the information would be submitted and be assessed. So just an example of a typical water license, and this is just a water license that I basically made up. So it's the top part of the license is just I suppose the broad details of the license: the owner, the address, the license number. I think the expiry date, tell me if I'm wrong here, Bill, but I think once you get a license, it's a 40-year license. So basically, to give some certainty around having a license, obviously you don't want a license that expires in 2 years' time and you've just spent, you know, a couple of $100,000 putting a center pivot irrigator in. You need to have a bit of certainty around the license. Not in saying that, the department can change conditions around the license, and they can potentially even withdraw a license, I suppose, under certain situations. But generally speaking, that's to give a bit of certainty around, you know, the longevity of having that water. So that top part of the license is really those details, and then the next bit, the bottom, this bit here is really the allocation part. So in this example, it's showing a 12 megalitre allocation. So say it might be a 12 megalitre dam. The surety level is 5, and I'll talk about surety levels in a moment. Basically saying that you can take water between the 1st of May and the 30th of November, which is sort of a typical, what we call winter period. So this is a license to take water into a dam during the winter between those months, and it's for irrigation. And generally here there's some easting and northing coordinates of where the location is. The bottom part of the license is generally got some conditions on it. So in this case, if there was, say, water restrictions put on, they would restrict the person to being able to take half a megalitre a day. I should also mention this is on a water course that's not named, so it's an unnamed tributary flowing into the sea, an unnamed water course flowing into the sea. So yeah, if restrictions are on, they would be limited to taking half a megalitre a day. And then the conditions on the license, the first condition is basically saying that a license holder needs to maintain records if and when the department may require some evidence, I suppose, around when you've taken that water, and so evidence around that you've taken it within the right period of time and the quantity. The second and third dot points are around passing water, in this case, through the dam. So basically, if you've got a dam on a water course, it's fairly standard to have that condition 2, where it says at least 50% of the water running into the dam needs to be maintained below the dam. Now, obviously, if a dam's filling, that might not be able to happen if it's, say, a flood's occurring. And dams on water courses also have to have an outlet pipe through the dam wall. So basically, condition 3 is saying if condition 2 can't be met, so you can't pass 50% of the flow because you just can't physically get that through your dam because it's filling, or through your outlet pipe, then basically it's saying the outlet pipe has to remain fully open until such time that condition 2 can be met, or the dam would be filled. Obviously, once the dam's full rather, and it's spilling, then effectively you're not taking water once it's full. So I suppose that's a fairly typical water license. There are water licenses with many more conditions than those on it, but that would probably represent, I'd be guessing, 70 to 80% of water allocations, you know, with your typical sort of farm dams that are out there. And in this case, this water license wasn't within a water management plan location, and I'll talk about water management plans in a sec. So surety levels, in that last example, it spoke about that winter take into a dam was surety 5. So the surety levels indicate I suppose the certainty, or to a degree, of which water can be expected to be available. So surety 5, for example, is generally available around 80% of the time, or it's got a reliability factor of 80%. So that's basically saying 8 years out of 10, you can expect to get that full water allocation. So it's not saying that you'll get it 100% of the time. And in reality, there'll be some allocations out there that are surety 5 where people do probably get it 100% of the time, but the department, I suppose, is saying we're not going to allocate water at 100% reliability because we can never guarantee that to be the case. So that surety 5 is a bit of a default 80% reliability. So at worst, they're basically saying that that water should be there at least 8 years out of 10. So with surety levels, probably the easiest way to explain surety is when water restrictions are imposed. So if you're on a river, for example, and you were, say the Huon River as an example, the different levels of surety are restricted from the highest surety to the lowest. So surety 7 and 8 are generally what we call flood takes. They're water that's available generally less than 50% reliability, or certainly a surety 7 is, and surety 8 is probably even lower than that. And but it's probably around greater than 20% of the time. So somewhere between 20 and 50% of the time, a surety 7 would be available for allocation. So they're generally flood takes. So if the river was in flood, then you may be able to take water under a surety 7, and sometimes under a surety 8. A surety 5 and surety 6 are more what I would call anyhow your typical winter take water licenses. Surety 5 being around that 80% reliability, and surety 6 being somewhere probably around between 60 and 70 to 80% reliability. A bit under 80, but not probably any lower than say 60%. So the department will allocate water based on how often they think that amount of water will be there in the system. So there might be some users on the stream that have surety 5 allocations, but in more recent times, the department are only allocating out surety 6 allocations because there's just not as much water there as reliable as it was, say, when those original landowners applied for those surety 5s. I should probably say too, the system generally is a first in, first served system. So if you apply for a license today and there's water available, then you'll get it. Just because you're a landowner on a water course doesn't mean that in 20 years' time you can apply and get water. So if you don't, so water can be a catchment could be fully allocated. And if you're a person that hasn't applied for an allocation and you decide to start irrigating in, say, 10 years' time, and you think there's plenty of water in the catchment, you may find that that's all fully allocated. So it is a bit of a first in, first served system. What I was going to say about restrictions though is surety 1 water is stock and domestic. So that could be a township, say in the case of the Huon, it could be say Huonville. And so they would have the highest right to water. If the department were restricting the taking of water out of that river. Surety 2, I think, is the environment. Surety 3 is some older rights that were established back under the old Act, what we used to call prescriptive rights. Surety 4, I think, is a hydro take. And then we've got surety 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if they were putting restrictions on, they'd obviously restrict surety 7 and 8 because they're flood takes. They'd be the first to go. Then they might restrict surety 6s. They'd be the next lowest reliability. Surety 5s then might get restricted. So that would be then a total ban of irrigation water. And then it's pretty rare that hydro or those surety 3 allocations would be restricted. But that, I suppose in theory, that's possible. So yeah, I've probably missed this slide. I've just spoke about this a bit. So basically, this talks about water restrictions when there isn't sufficient water available in the river at a given point in time. And there are some rivers in Tasmania that are fairly heavily allocated, and probably to a degree, certainly in some summer water, in some cases they might be slightly over allocated, and that's probably more of a historical thing that a lot of those allocations were issued back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Environmental flows back in those days probably weren't considered as much as they are today. And yeah, so there would be some rivers that are slightly over allocated, but we certainly don't have any scenarios like the mainland would with, say, the Murray-Darling system, where that river system is heavily over allocated. So on your water license, or the example that I showed before, it had the amount of water that you can take and the period or the date range that you could take that water in. So in that example, it was 12 megalitres between the 1st of May and the 30th of November. You can be required to make sure that you accurately account for that water. So that might be through a water meter. It might be simply recording how much water you've taken, say, on a weekly basis. So it does pay to keep some records of what water you take and when you take it, and I suppose how you've taken it, because the department might do some compliance checks. They might do some auditing of certain catchments, and it is an obligation of a water license holder to make sure they keep account for the water that they take. As I touched on before, you can basically transfer a water license or an allocation. So some examples of that might be if I sold my property, I might also want to transfer my water license and allocation with that. If you sell your property, it's not automatic that the water license and allocation will be transferred with the property, because it's not. Those license or that license and allocation isn't attached to the land. It's actually owned by the person that owns the license. So yeah, so solicitors generally these days would make sure that if the new owner was looking at requiring that water, they'd make sure that the old owner or the previous owner would look at transferring that license to them, and that'd be a contract or part of the sale of the property, that the license and the allocation goes with the sale of the land. But it's not an automatic process. You do have to physically apply to transfer that, and you have to go through the department to do that. So there's a transfer form that would need to be completed for a license to go from one person to another at the point of sale. You can just transfer the allocation part of the license. So you could keep your water license if you might have several properties, for example. You can have one water license and have your allocations scattered across several properties. So you don't have to have numerous water licenses. You can just have the one license with multiple allocations on it. So you might sell off, for example, 2 of those allocations to somebody else, and you can transfer those to that person, providing they've got a water license then to put those allocations on. Other reasons for transferring a license might be that it might be a part of an estate. It might be, and it could be transferred on a permanent or a temporary basis. So it's quite regular or quite common that somebody might have a license with an allocation and they might not be using it, and then somebody will use that allocation on a temporary basis, say to do some irrigation, and that's I suppose an arrangement between those two people, but providing the department does know about that transfer of the allocation.
That's why I'd say something, yeah, Brooksy. Sure. One thing with transferring of allocations, and it's pretty obvious, but it's not always obvious to some people, I guess. It's transfer of allocations can be, as you've mentioned, either permanent or limited period. They're generally up and down the same catchment. You can't transfer an allocation to an adjacent catchment or from one river to another river. It doesn't work like that. So essentially, yeah, it is within that same catchment. And if you are transferring it to a neighbour, i.e. you might be leasing it for a limited period to a neighbour, it does have to go back to the department for review. When they review it, they can, for instance, if you're transferring it upstream, they may review, or generally will review the volumes involved and determine whether or not that volume is available at the location further upstream, because it may not be, the full volume may not be available if you're transferring it upstream, for instance. So just be aware that, it's not, if you've got a volume and you want to transfer it to a neighbour, 10 k's upstream, it's no guarantee that that volume will be available at that location.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do get a few inquiries from time to time about people selling water, from one party to another, and really that's a private matter between those two individuals. But as James just said, and that they do need to, so if someone does sell an allocation to another person, that needs to go to the department and make sure it meets a few rules, I suppose, around what James was just explaining. And that could be a limited period transfer, like a temporary basis, or it could be an absolute transfer on a permanent basis. And if you are, say, letting water down a watercourse, it might even be just the one person that's letting water from one property down to another property. It could be over a distance of, in some cases, 10 or 20 kilometres. It's not uncommon. Generally now you have to set up what's called a watercourse authority. So that's basically allows them to let water out, say it's water stored in a dam, let it down a watercourse, and then pick that water up further down. And there might be some conditions around, or some rules on that watercourse authority, things like transmission losses, for example. It might be that they have to do some assessments before that watercourse authority is approved around whether that full amount of water would be available if they were to let it, say, 10 k's down the river. In most cases, it would be at least a minimum of, say, a 10% transmission loss. So say, for example, you're letting out 10 megalitres a day out of a dam, you might only be able to take 9 megalitres at the point where you're going to pump it, and there'd be a 10% transmission loss. That transmission loss could be higher than 10. That would, I think, 10 is probably the minimum default, if that's right, Bill. In some cases, those transmission losses can be in the 20% range or more, depending on the watercourse that you're letting the water down. So there are a few rules around transferring water around under between parties, and also even just individuals themselves. And the department obviously can explain this in more detail if somebody wants to do that. So temporary water allocations, they're probably not that common, but there are people that take temporary water allocations from time to time, and this is probably water that the department's not prepared to allocate out under a water allocation. It might be that the water's not there very often, but they do recognise that the water might be there at certain times in big flow events. So if there's a flood occurring and somebody they might want to take more than their allocation, for example, then they can potentially apply to the department for a temporary water allocation at the time that rainfall event or flood is occurring, and get a temporary allocation. And it might be as simple. Some rivers might have a little trigger point, like the photo in this slide, where if the level of the creek gets above a certain point on the gauge board, then they might allow people to take water under a temporary allocation system. It's probably a little bit similar to Surety 7 and 8 type water, albeit it's an informal process rather than having a Surety 7 or 8 allocations is, I suppose, a bit more formal in that you've got that allocation. You don't have to apply for it each year. It just has to meet a trigger for you to take that water. And there's generally some conditions around how you can take that temporary sort of water. That's the slide about watercourse authority that I've already spoken about. So as I said, if you're transferring water down a watercourse, you do need to potentially at least apply for a watercourse authority, and again, the department can provide more information on that if somebody wanted to do that. I mentioned before hydro catchments and water management plans. I'll talk on hydro catchments first and jump in, Bill, if I get this wrong. But basically, Hydro Tasmania has a special licence to take water for generation purposes I suppose in line with government strategies around its energy policy. And so there's a number of catchments across the state that are effectively what we call a hydro catchment. An example would be the Southwest catchment. You've got Trevelyan Dam, a power generation dam at the bottom of that catchment. So anything upstream of that catchment effectively sits in a hydro run catchment, if you like. And so hydro pretty much have, or they have ownership's probably the wrong word, but it'll do in terms of explaining this. They have ownership of the water within that catchment, other than you can still take stock in domestic water. So landowners can take stock in domestic water, providing they've got a riparian right to that water. But if from anything of a commercial nature, hydro effectively owns that water. So to take water for a commercial purpose within a hydro catchment, you have to, well, first see if there's water available under the water assessment tool, which I'll talk about in a sec, and see if that water is available. And then if it is, then you also have to get hydro to agree to a transfer of that amount to you. So say, for example, you're applying for 100 megalitres of water for a dam. It's available under the assessment tool process, but then we have to go through hydro and get them to agree to that transfer. And generally they'll allow a transfer, well, in most cases, providing you pay the loss of power generation that they would have got out of that water had it gone through their power station. So in the case of, say, Trevelyan Dam, I think the cost of power generation, tell me if I'm wrong here, Bill, was somewhere between $10 and $20 a megalitre. So if you applied for 100 megalitres, say it's $20 a megalitre, you'd have to pay hydro an annual fee of $2,000. There is a few other ways that hydro can allow you to take that water, but that's just an example, I suppose, of one way, or the most common way, in that they would allow you to take that water. And you might have to have a water meter to demonstrate that you are only taking the quantity that you actually applied for. You also need a water allocation and license in the department to do that. So you basically need a license and allocation still, but you also need approval from Hydro TAS to take that water. So as that point 3 says, basically a landowner needs to get agreement from hydro to be able to transfer water with a hydro catchment. Water management plans and what they call water management statements. There's quite a few catchments scattered across the state that have plans and these water management statements. Basically, what they are is that they've been developed in consultation with stakeholders within those catchments to, I suppose, develop a more rigorous set of rules, if that's the right word, to manage the water resource within that catchment, to make sure that there's not an over allocation going to occur, so the environment's protected, but at the same time making sure that everyone understands what water's available and how it can be allocated. So when applying for an allocation within a water management plan catchment, we have to do a couple of things. We have to run the water assessment tool to see if there's water available under the hydrological model that the department's got. If it's showing water available, then we then default to the plan, and within that plan there's some allocation limits normally outlined. It might be broken down into various catchments within a catchment. So for example, there's a plan on the Little Swamport catchment, and that's got several sub-catchments within that plan of how much water can be allocated within each of those little catchments, and how much. And that plan basically says how much there is to still allocate. Then you have to subtract what's already been allocated, and if there's still water available after we work out how much has already been allocated, then somebody may be able to get an allocation for an additional amount of water. And water management statements, I suppose, are similar in a sense. They're probably not as involved as a water management plan, but they do document some rules around how water is allocated within those catchments. An example of a catchment with a water management statement, I think, is the Swan catchment, which has got TAS irrigation water also coming out of that catchment, along with you know, some water allocations that are generally historical allocations. I don't know if I've explained that correctly, Bill, but yeah, hopefully people get what I'm talking about with that. So the water assessment tool, I'll just do a little live demonstration. I'll just have to close the PowerPoint presentation down and just bear with me for a second, and I'll open up the water assessment tool. So as I said earlier, the water assessment tool is a hydrological model, effectively, or the front end of a hydrological model that the department developed to allow not only consultants, but also the department uses themselves in-house to easily access, I suppose, or assess how much water is available on a water course within a catchment within Tasmania. So it's quite a lot of detailed modelling in the back end of this water assessment tool. I can remember back when this was being developed, it took a few years to develop, and there was a lot of hydrological modelling going on in the background to get this as accurate as they can. So I'm going to have to go out of this and come back in. Sorry. So just bear with me a sec. It doesn't like being open for too long. So hopefully it'll let me open it. And then that's lucky. I'll just do a couple of examples. So basically we get a map of Tasmania. We'll go to a location. So I'll just put in a location. So I can put in an easting and a northing, just up here in the top left-hand corner. We'll just put in any old amount for the time being. It doesn't have to be the amount you're actually applying for. So we basically selected this spot. I think it's a tributary of the Leven River up in the northwest coast. I'll run the assessment. So I've just randomly picked a spot. I don't actually know whose property it is. It doesn't matter for the purposes of the demonstration. It just takes a few seconds to run. And it basically spits out some water, and it divides the catchment up into, I suppose, 3 main areas. So basically the first area is what we call the catchment area of the offtake or the dam assessment. So this little box down here in the bottom is referring to the catchment area that's shown here in red. The subcatchment is the darker orange, which is a fair proportion of this catchment, and then the yellow area is just the bottom end of the catchment. So the bottom end of the catchment is really just that bottom end of the Leven River. The subcatchment's a fairly substantial part of it, and then the dam or the offtake or the dam catchment is that little red spot. So basically what this is saying in this box here at this assessment level, it's saying that there's 68.5 megalitres available at high availability water, which is surety 5, and another 20.29 megalitres available at this mid availability, which is what we call the surety 6 water. So all up, there's around 86 megs available at this point if this person was to apply for this water. But we do need to work our way down the water. So that's at that point. We need to just check down the river. So at the catchment level, it's saying that there's a lot of water allocated, but there's still a significant amount of water available. And similarly, at the catchment level, there's a lot of water allocated, but still plenty of water available. We also do need to work our way down the catchment if there's any other large dams that might, say, for example, there was a 200 megalitre dam just downstream of this one. Even though it's saying here there's 86 megs available, effectively there wouldn't be, because that water would be used for that downstream dam. So we need to make sure that existing users are protected, and we can click over here on the right and actually include all the offtakes or all the locations of allocations that are in existence within this catchment. I won't go into too much detail around the rest of how the assessment's done. There are a few other little things that you can change in terms of the reference sites that it uses. Probably worth noting that it also does select the catchment area above that point. So for this example, it's saying that the catchment area is 0.64, just over here on the left-hand side, 0.64 of a square kilometre or 64 hectares. And it gives you, I think it's the centroid of the catchment, it gives you an estimate of what the average rainfall is, which in this case is 1,243 millimetres. So that's your typical sort of farm dam type assessment. I'll just do one more quick one. So we're probably running out of time here, but I'll try and do it quickly on another water course just to give you a second example. So this one's on the Prosser River on the east coast. So if we run that assessment, say for example, someone was applying for a water allocation at the bottom of the Prosser, they might want to pump into a farm dam, or they might want to build a farm dam on a tributary. This is a catchment that's now, so at this location, it's telling me that there's 2,082 megalitres available of high reliability water. It's over allocated at the Surety 6 level. But if we just go downstream a little bit further, I know that TAS Water take water out of this river right at the bottom end. So they've got an allocation to do that. So down around here is where TAS Water, that cross there. And that shows that the catchment's fully allocated. So with all the existing allocations in this catchment, you basically, if someone applied for this scenario, there wouldn't be any water available. So pretty much in that whole catchment now, it's fully allocated for winter take water, and obviously for summer take water as well, because that's generally pretty unlikely in a catchment like the Prosser. So that's a catchment that's fully allocated, and the only way a person could get water is to look at transferring or buying water off somebody else that's got an existing allocation and doing a transfer. I'll just go back into the slideshow. Yeah, so that water assessment tool is sorry, I'll just go back, sorry. Yeah, that water assessment tool is what I just showed you. I was going to show you a quick slide of the list, but I don't think I've got it up there, so I won't do that. The list tool is another mapping tool that the department's developed. It's really handy in terms of showing where allocations are, and it can be something that's used by consultants, or is used by consultants in that early assessment phase of the whole process. I've probably talked enough about all this stuff. So some take-home messages. Certainly, we would recommend, obviously, that individuals get an experienced consultant to navigate their way through this process. Not only the water allocation process, but as James talked about last week, the dam assessment process. They're not complicated in the sense that you need to be a rocket scientist to understand this, but it's a reasonably involved process, and without some knowledge of both processes, it's pretty difficult for individuals to be able to do that themselves. And in the case of water assessments, you actually need to get a consultant because they have access to that water assessment tool. That's not publicly available. It's the department's only really made that available to consultants because there needs to be some I suppose rigor around how that's used. So other take-home messages: ensure water is available for allocation before proceeding to a dam site. So there's no point having a great dam site, as Jane mentioned last week, and then find there's no water available. So the good dam sites, as James mentions, are the ones that are buildable or constructible, and then the ones that you can also get water for to put in it. Know what the conditions are on your water licence. That's fairly important, especially in times of, say, drought in particular. And as I just sort of mentioned, some catchments are already fully allocated. So don't leave it too late to apply for water licence if you're thinking about undertaking some irrigation down the track. Do you want me to hand back to you for this bit, Joe, or do you want me to keep talking?
Sure, Alistair. Yeah, so for those of you that didn't join last Tuesday, this is just to let you know that there are some resources available. So everything that's presented today, you will find on the NRE website. we've also distilled it down into what a really farmer-focused set of resources here. A quick guide, which is available electronically on the Hub website, and I'll post that in the chat in just a second. And also a bit of a case study, which is like, if you like, a common question that might be asked as people embark on this process. So yeah, both of those are available electronically, and we can also post those out. So we're going to open it up to any questions now. There's nothing in the chat, but please feel free to unmute if you would like to ask a question to the team. I don't think there are any. Everyone that's on the screen from the delivery team are very willing to take questions. So if something does come to mind after today, feel free to email us on the email address that you received the link from, and we can make sure we pass that on. We would really appreciate everyone giving us a really quick snapshot of your feedback of the webinars. You can scan the QR code that's on the screen now using your mobile, or you can press on the link that I've just posted in the chat. It's literally a sort of a 3-question feedback form just to help us improve our delivery and resources for the future and pass that on to the rest of the team. So thank you very much. If there aren't any questions that anyone has just thought of, please feel free to jump off whenever you like. Otherwise, we'll remain online just for a minute or so to see if there are any last-minute questions. But thank you, Alistair. Thanks, James.
Thanks.
Thanks, Henry and Bill, also for joining us for the last 2 webinars.